Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Emily Norton, and I'm the Executive Director of the Charles River Watershed Association. I will be introducing tonight's speaker. First, some housekeeping. I don't have to tell you. Oops, let me make sure we've started. Have we started? Maddie, we good? I'm going to assume that everything's okay. I haven't heard from technical support that it's not. I don't have to tell you where the exits or the bathrooms are. They're where they've always been in your home, so that should be comforting. But I do want to say, if you have any technical difficulties, please email charles@crwa.org or post something in the chat. Our staff are monitoring those. This is only the second event in our virtual series, so please have patience with us if anything glitches. Before we get started, I want to note we also have some additional events coming up that you may also be interested in. On May 7th, we have an event on climate resilience for activists. The presenters are yours truly, along with Vernon Walker of CRWA, that's Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, and that is an arm of 350 Mass. And then on May 14th, we are doing a presentation on dam removals and why they're a good thing for the Charles River and our current efforts to remove 3 of them. So I hope that you will be back for both of those events. Okay, now on to tonight's event. We are excited to have over 100 RSVPs. We are also streaming live on Facebook, and everyone is on mute. So if you have any questions or comments, and we hope that you do, please post them in the Q&A box anytime, and we will get to them after the presentation, and we'll have a back and forth. And with that, I will introduce our speaker. Bob Zimmerman served as the Executive Director of the Charles River Watershed Association from 1990 to 2018. During his tenure, CRWA became a leading authority on the science of water in urban watersheds and developed programs that addressed stormwater pollution, water quality, low in-stream flow, nutrient loading, habitat protection and restoration, community zoning, suburban sprawl, sustainable development and water demand, the economics of water infrastructure transformation, and climate change mitigation and adaptation. Today, US EPA considers the Charles River the cleanest urban river in the nation. Prior to working at CRWA, Bob co-founded and was the headmaster of the National Sports Academy at Lake Placid, a boarding school offering a preparatory curriculum and training program for winter sports athletes. CRWA and the Charles River were the 2011 winners of the prestigious International River Foundation's Theiss International Riverprize. And on a personal note, I'm very grateful to Bob for his support for me in this transition. It's not easy to follow in the footsteps of someone who's been there for 28 years and has accomplished so much, but he did not cut and run. Bob has been an amazing resource for me many, many times over the last 2 years and will continue to be, I am confident. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Bob.
Okay, this is my speaker.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
I want to just say behind Emily's head there is a picture, I think, of Milford and/or Medway. It's the Natural Valley Storage Project. My predecessor, a woman named Rita Barron, who had been executive director from 73 through 88, convinced the Army Corps of Engineers to protect 13 square miles of wetlands in fee simple rather than build levees on the Charles, which to this day is the largest acquisition of wetlands by the Army Corps in its history, and is something that I certainly learned to celebrate, and I learned a great deal from her. So there's a history here of passing on from one to the other. Okay, I'm going to share this screen. This has been kind of fun. I haven't been back through combined sewer overflows and sort of where the Charles River and the Watershed Association were back in 1990, 91, 92, 93. Since then, since about 2000, so the better part of 20 plus years. And let's see, this is, okay, I want to reintroduce everyone. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Charles River, but the watershed is a different thing. The watershed is a 308 square mile area that drains to the Charles River. And that in blue is that 308 square mile area. The nice thing about the Charles River is that it's human scale. It's not the Mississippi, it's not the Merrimack, it's not, you know, 5 or 10,000 square miles and difficult to get your head around. And here's the river, of course, enhanced several million times to make it stand out. It was often described by the Indians as a reluctant river. Didn't really want to get to Boston. About 1.1 million of us call it home. And this is obviously a satellite view of downtown Boston, Cambridge, Chelsea. East Boston, think for a minute that you're a drop of rainwater falling out of the sky, and your major goal in life is to try to fall on something nice and soft and green. Good luck. Let me take you back. This is the 70s. This is up in Milford. This is the headwaters of the Charles. The white stuff is some kind of a talconite. I don't have any idea what the pink stuff was, but it's not pretty. This is a dump in West Roxbury, and you notice that there was no dumping allowed in that area. One of the things that's important to remember is that through the middle 70s, wetland areas were considered disposable areas, good places to dump stuff. And you'll notice that's what we're doing here. This is a toxic spill in Waltham. I think this dates to the early 1970s, as I recall. This is a fish kill out in front of the Perkins School for the Blind. This used to happen all the time because toxins in the water used to suck all the air out of the water. And the fish obviously can't live without oxygen. Okay, so back in 1992-93, there were a series of meetings that were hosted by the Environmental Protection Agency and the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority over what are called combined sewer overflows. Combined sewers are when the storm drain and the sanitary sewer share the same pipe, which sounds like a crazy idea, but you have to remember that the pipes, the sewer pipes in downtown Boston were constructed in 1854. And back in 1854, the major mode of transportation had 4 hooves. Those horses left deposits. And the reason that the sewers were combined was that during rainstorms, they cleaned the streets and swept the manure into the drains and got it out of town that way. So a combined sewer made great sense through the 19th century and even into the early 20th century. It's when we started to change things to 4 wheels rather than 4 hooves, and then begin to pave everything over, that combined sewers started to become a problem. The other 2 problems that we encountered back in the early 90s were stormwater pollution, and then in the Charles, particularly in the months of July, August, and September, low base in-stream flow. That is, the amount of water in the river would drop back and the lower basin would become, in effect, a big pond. This is what a combined sewer actually looks like. This is down by the Museum of Science. This picture was taken in 1988. As you can see, you probably don't want to row your boat or go swimming when one of these things activates. And this is a scheme for the major sewer systems that the MWRA operates. They serve 43 communities, about 2.3 million people. The waste goes into these big red pipes, they're called interceptors, and head out to Deer Island for treatment to the tune of a total of about 300 million gallons a day. It's treated and then disposed out into the middle of Massachusetts Bay. A few things to note about what's treated. The diurnal flow of wastewater is the purple along the bottom. That's about 150 million gallons a day. The light blue is what's called infiltration. That's groundwater leaking into the system. And the dark blue is what's called inflow. That's rainwater getting into the combined system and causing problems. And as you can see, between infiltration and inflow, the capacity of the system is seriously tested. And this gives you an idea of the communities with combined sewers: Chelsea, Somerville, Cambridge, and Boston. And then the areas on the Charles River where overflows were allowed. Now, the reason that we have combined sewer overflows is that as the sewer pipe fills up with stormwater in a rain event, with the sewage already there, the stormwater comes in and starts to flow out of town. And if you get more than 2 inches or so of rain, 1.5 inches it used to be, of rain in town, the sewers can't handle that rain. What happens when the sewer gets to be about 80–90% of its capacity, the water in the pipe slows down and it begins to back up, and it backs up into people's basements and homes. Engineers didn't think that was a really good idea, so what they did was put what are called regulators or pipes in, so that when the sewer pipe got 70% filled, the excess water was allowed to blow directly into nearby surface water. There were 21 overflow sites on the Charles. There were a couple of really big ones. The biggest was Cottage Farm, which you'll see there right in the middle of this graphic. And system-wide, there were about 3.3 billion gallons in a typical year. That typical year was, at the time, the 62-year period of record in 1993. All the rainfall added up and divided by 62, and that was their average typical year. And on the entire system, which included Boston Harbor and the Mystic and parts of the Neponset River, there were 30 such events in a typical year. On the Charles, more than half of the combined sewage discharged. So 1.76 billion gallons were discharged to the river in a typical year in 28 events, again, on average. And if you start to think about that, that's a lot of events, like 1 every 2 weeks. And it certainly renders the river useless for the kinds of things that we all like to do over the last 10 miles. That is from Watertown Dam down to the new Charles River Dam right on the harbor. So with the Clean Water Act in 1972, it became illegal to dump sewage directly into the waters of the United States. But nothing was done in Boston until Conservation Law Foundation sued the city of Boston and the state of Massachusetts over the condition of the harbor and the condition of the tributaries to the harbor. And by 1988, the city had lost that suit, state had lost that suit. And a judge was in a federal district court judge, David Mazzoni, was responsible for telling the city and state what to do. So they started building Deer Island in 1990. A lot of good things started to happen. But the combined sewer overflow problem was a difficult one. The cookie cutter solution nationwide was to build what's called a deep tunnel. And we all know how cheap it is to dig a big hole in the ground, as we learned with the Big Dig. The idea would be to dig a big hole next to and underneath the Charles River. And then when a combined sewer event occurred, the idea would be to use drop shafts, take all of the excess water, drop it down into the big hole in the ground. And then when the rain event was over, pump it out treat it, and discharge it. The estimated cost in $1995 for such a deep tunnel was $2.3 billion. Anyway, I got introduced to all of this in 92 and 93, and I remember sitting in a presentation by the MWRA and their consultant, who at the time was Metcalf and Eddy, talking about how dirty the Charles was, and that the Charles had always been dirty, and therefore it was always going to be dirty, and we should just learn to accept that, I think was the basis of the argument. Anyway, in late 1993, early 1994, they decided they didn't want to build a deep tunnel, which is what EPA wanted them to build. And they suggested that what they were going to do was capture most, not all, but most of the combined sewage at Cottage Farm, and then chlorinate it, and then dechlorinate it and release it to the river. So that was supposed to kill all the bacteria. Those of you who know much about chlorination know that chlorine doesn't kill very many viruses unless the viruses are introduced to it for a long period of time. And I'm sitting in the back of the room and I'm thinking, geez, you know, I wonder if the Charles was dirty 300 years ago. I bet not. And the other thing I noticed was that we tended to study the Charles in discrete segments. So Metcalf and Eddy had studied the last 9.5 miles of the river where their combined sewer overflow sites were. But the other 71 miles of the river, they didn't bother with anything that came over Watertown Dam. Or if you were in Weston or Newton, or, you know, and you had a project, you studied the river for 400 feet or 400 yards, you know, the site conditions of your particular project, and you applied for permits, and life was good, and you got your permit, and you proved that you weren't doing anything harmful to the river because the river was already dirty and hammered. And it occurred to me that this was probably death by 1,000 cuts. So I thought, you know, maybe what we should do is start to look at the river as a system, a watershed and a river that work together. This is a quick list of how everybody else did it. I'll give you a couple of examples. In Chicago, which was the first deep tunnel solution, the cost of the deep tunnel, which parallels the Chicago River for 18 miles, and the 6 reservoirs that they built in addition, was cheap. Only $18 billion over 20 years to construct that. Milwaukee was $2 billion. Seattle, I forget the number, but I think it was close to $3 billion. Anyway, this whole traditional wastewater engineering approach of, you know, sort of figuring out how much water and then figuring out how to control that volume of water and then getting on with life struck me as strange. So one of the things that happened in 1993 is I met a guy named Mike Dominica, who was an engineer at the time working for the MWRA. And one of the things he did was revolutionary. He said, you know, it'd be good if we could figure out how the sewer system itself works. So we put in flow meters in all of the major interceptors in Boston and figured a couple of important things. He figured that the sewage from the north arrives at the treatment plant first. The sewage from the south arrives second. The sewage from the central western area arrives third. There are 5 lift stations that take the water once it gets down to Boston Harbor and lifts it up and gets it out to Deer Island. And they were inadequate to handle all of the water once all of it appeared. So as I recall, don't hold me to this, but I believe that with the addition of $15 million worth of pumps They reduced sewage activations, combined sewage activations by 50%. Seems like pretty amazing. And then they figured using a computer model, a stormwater management model, how much water would otherwise appear and how much they needed to control. Watching Mike inspired me to think that maybe we needed to go beyond just understanding the system and get a better handle on how the city and wastewater actually interact with the river and cause these problems and where the water comes from in the first place. One of the things that has been learned around the country with these deep tunnels is that spending these enormous sums of money doesn't necessarily solve the problem. You get to 80% control and 20% still causes serious problems, and EPA, at least in its former iterations, wouldn't accept that as good enough. The other thing that came up in this these series of presentations by the MWRA on their solution, their preferred solution, was excuse me, I have a phone going off here. Get rid of it. Excuse me. Was to define areas as, geez, we need to clean them up, and other areas as, geez, we don't need to clean them up. The two areas that MWRA initially suggested were areas that were so dirty that they couldn't be cleaned up were the Charles River and Fort Point Channel. And that, you know, the bang for the buck just wasn't great enough to clean them up because they were going to be dirty anyway. So they were going to change the use designation on the Charles from Class B to Class B CSO, they called it, which would allow for permitting of combined sewage in the Charles River. We didn't like that idea at all. So we decided that what we would do is begin to study the entire river and try to figure out what was happening with the entire river, stop treating stormwater. I mean, you know, rainfall, it's kind of a natural thing, as an out of boundary event, which was MWRA's characterization. You know, they don't control stormwater and it's not in their pipes, so it's not really their problem. I went around and raised a few bucks to begin a $1.9 million study we call the Integrated Monitoring, Modeling, and Management Plan. I do have to add that the first company to give us money was Enron. You remember them? They kind of got in trouble a little later, but nevertheless. And one of the major donors to the study was the MWRA, because they were convinced that whatever we did, we were going to come back and prove that, in fact, the river was dirty. So what we did was to begin to study the entire river. We broke it up into 37 sites. I think there are still 35 sites that the association monitors monthly, that we monitored monthly, and I believe 10 sites that we monitored for a much longer suite of water chemistry, including phosphorus and the like. And we also looked at the 10 largest tributaries to the Charles on a once-a-month basis. And the first thing we discovered was that the MWRA's argument that over the Watertown Dam came all of this sewage, which came from the other 270, 280 square miles of the watershed, was in fact dead wrong. As you can see here in red, the lower basin up to Watertown does in fact fail during dry weather for sewage. But the rest of the watershed, with the exception of a couple of these yellow spots, which are some failures in those reaches, the rest of the watershed actually meets swimming standards during dry weather, which changed the nature of the conversation that we were having with the MWRA. All of a sudden, we weren't just loud voices sitting in the back. We were actually an organization that was presenting information that the EPA gobbled up, and a guy named John DeVillers, who was the regional administrator, started to turn into permits. So I want to go back to that. This is 1996 wet weather for bacteria. And as you can see, the entire river fails. So clearly something's going on between dry weather and wet weather that causes a lot of bacteria to end up in the river. And since the combined sewers are only in the lower basin, the cause of this problem can't be combined sewers. So one of the things we started to do was to go around and identify these guys. These are storm drain outfalls that run when it's not raining. If they run when it's not raining, that means that a lot of water is coming from someplace, getting into these pipes and causing problems on the river. And all of these pipes have low-lying areas, so that a lot of the water and what's ever in that water collects and lies there. And then when you get a storm event, it all gets flushed out. In 1996, we built our own lab, and we were able to begin to monitor these things. And we discovered that, in effect, storm drains were the same as combined sewers. Turns out when people built houses and buildings, and in one case, an entire Harvard dormitory, they attached the wastewater pipe from those buildings to the wrong pipe in the ground. Storm drain is one pipe. The sanitary sewer generally goes down the middle of the street. The developer didn't get all the way to the sanitary sewer, hooked up to the wrong pipe. And so whenever wastewater is discharged into the storm drain, this is called an illegal cross connection. That wastewater sits there, and then during wet weather events, it all comes tumbling out into the river. The difference between a combined sewer, which discharges combined sewage and stormwater to the Charles in the lower basin, it discharges at about 300,000 to 500,000 colony forming units of fecal bacteria. In one of these storm drains, which have illegal cross connections associated with it, we discovered that they discharge to the river at 30 to 50,000 colony forming units, CFUs, per 100 milliliters of water. 100 milliliters of water is about as much water as would fit in your grandmother's fine teacup. You get the drift. By the way, the standard for boating is 1,000 colony forming units, and the standard for swimming is 200 colony forming units per 100 ml. So anyway, we got into a big argument with the MWRA. I won't get into it. A couple of them were quite colorful. Well, one, we were presenting to 200 people at a Kennedy School auditorium, and the MWRA had just made a presentation on how chlorination, dechlorination was a great idea, and I had hidden a 3-gallon bucket under the lectern, and I got up and spoke afterwards and said, you know, well, you're going to chlorinate and dechlorinate, but all the goo is still in the water. So there's not very much bacteria. And then I pulled my bucket up from behind the lectern and I said, so I just filled this bucket up with 3 gallons of that water that's been discharged. Is there anybody in the room who wants to stick his or her head in the bucket? And I thought the reps from the MWRA were going to have a heart attack, but I made my point. Ultimately, over a period of about 18 months of negotiation and a serious examination of the MWRA system. By the way, our friend Mike Dominica had left the MWRA and started working as a consultant with us. And our hydrologist was a woman named Kate Bowditch, and our civil engineer was a woman named Kathy Baskin. Started to plot on ways to best handle this. And what they determined was that the majority of the water came from culverted areas. What's shown on this map are those same culverted areas. The big long one there in the middle is called Stony Brook and was contributed by far the most combined sewage to the river. And then by select separation of those areas so that the storm water never got into the pipes, we ended up with a $91 million solution that reduced the active discharges from 1.76 billion gallons in a typical year to 7 million gallons in a typical year, which I believe, as I recall, is 99.3% control. I do know that that remains the best control of any of the 1,200 cities that have combined sewers in the United States. And you'll notice the cost. 91 million versus chlorination, dechlorination at 540 million versus 2.3 billion for a deep tunnel. And you know, I never did get that thank you note from the MWRA for saving them all of that money. Anyway, CRWA in this process learned a lot. And the whole nature of the organization changed. Once we added a hydrologist and a civil engineer, and then we added a computer modeler, and then we added an attorney, environmental attorney, to help us in this work. The whole nature of the relationship that CRWA had with the EPA, with the State Department of Environmental Protection, with cities and towns, with developers, fundamentally changed. We also confronted the illicit connection problem. EPA, under de Villers, started to enforce, I mean, it's illegal to be connected to the wrong pipe in the ground. So Boston Water and Sewer Commission and Cambridge DPW under John Sullivan in Boston and Owen O'Riordan, both of whom are still there in Cambridge, started to TV their storm drain lines. And in the process, they identified the illegal connections. CRWA, working in the other 8 towns upstream of Cambridge in Boston and the Charles, by testing the tributaries, identified those tributaries where sewage was getting into the river. And over the space of about 18 months, 1.5 million gallons daily of raw sewage pouring into the river was eliminated. So the combination of the reduction, dramatic reduction in combined sewage and the dramatic reduction in the illegal cross connections got us to a place where in 1997, we started flying flags to let people know when the conditions on the river were good and when they weren't. They also got us to a place which is pretty similar by 1999 to where we are right now. So in 1995, when we started this work, the river met boating standards, or 1,000 CFUs per 100 milliliters of water, 39% of the time, and swim standards 19% of the time. When we were done in 1999, we met boating standards 92% of the time, which I believe today is very close to 100% of the time, and swim standards 65% of the time because of stormwater issues. That's still about, I think, where the river is now for swimming, someplace in the 60 to 75% range, depending on how much it rains that year. This is a great picture. On the left is a guy named Fred Lasky, who's the executive director of the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority. In the center is John DeVillers, who was the regional administrator of EPA. And on the right is a guy named Paul Parisky, who is government community relations with MIT. We all illegally jumped into the Charles River because you could. This is 1998, summer of 1998. However, in all of this, we did learn that cleaning up the river has issues. Sunlight begins to penetrate, and other kinds of problems that the river faces begin to surface. This is cyanobacteria, blue-green algae. It's not good stuff. It happens almost every summer on the river, and the blooms are getting bigger. Using the same sort of approach, we started to investigate in 99 and 2000, 2001, where that stuff comes from. It's dependent on phosphorus in the river and the river warming up in the summertime. And so in a unique study, in combination with the Department of Environmental Protection and EPA, we broke up the Charles into its major land forms, land use types. You'll notice on the right side here, particularly commercial, industrial, and high-density residential properties, representing 20% of the total 308 square miles of the river. And on the basis of land use type, you'll notice that commercial, industrial, and high-density residential land use types contribute far more than their share of phosphorus to the river. This was and remains a completely unique study. We completed this study in 2004, as I recall, and it was finalized by EPA in 2009. And the concern here is that this is not caused by fertilizer, this phosphorus loading. It's caused by cars and parking lots. You'll remember way back when I started this, I said the three big problems were combined sewer overflows, stormwater pollution, and low base in-stream flow. And over the course of IM3, the study of CSOs and how the watershed worked, and then added on where phosphorus comes from and the like, we discovered that those aren't really the problems. Those are the symptoms. The problem is the way we build cities. We treat rainwater as a liability and we throw it away. We build all of these impervious surfaces, parking lots and roadways, buildings and the like. And the water that runs off them gets polluted very quickly. And it also moves very, very quickly across parking lots into storm drains. So it carries a lot of bad stuff. And our solution to all of the problems we face with water are bigger, centralized pipes, pumps, and demand. And in the process, we discovered these two really fundamental aspects. of the study of water in urban areas, that the restoration of lost environmental function resolves most of the water problems we face, and that keeping water local, just like nature does, not letting it get away in the first place, not throwing away 300 million gallons out in the middle of Massachusetts Bay every day, would be a really good idea. Just to give you some sense, remember that buried stream I showed you, Stony Brook? It goes right through Northeastern's campus. This is what it looks like now. This was what it could look like if we started to restore these things. And associated with soils in the ground that would recharge that same brook, this is what the industrial area surrounding looks like now. This is what it could look like if we started to remake the way our cities work with water. So that's the sum and substance of my presentation. But I leave with this comment and perhaps warning. If what we do now into the future is repair, rebuild, and expand the centralized systems that we built over the last 150 years, the result is not going to be good. There's a way out of this box, but it doesn't, it goes in exactly the opposite direction of repairing, rebuilding, and expanding large centralized systems. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bob. That was terrific, as I knew it would be. One of the many things I've learned from you was that background. So with that, I would like to hit some of the questions that have come in. So one question was, are those percentages the average over the whole Charles River, or are certain areas safer than others? I think that was the part of your presentation where you were talking about the boating and swimming standards that I think was the lower basin, but you can clarify that.
That's exactly right. That's for the last 10 miles of the river. The rest of the river, with the exception, at least in the 90s and early 2000s, of Milford, where you can't swim anyway, meets standards close to 100% of the time.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So I know that you know the answer to this one because this is an early question that I had for you. How do cars in parking lots contribute phosphorus?
Gasoline, oil leaks out of them. When you start your car, that's when modern cars, before the catalytic converter is heated up, that's when they drop most of their pollution. There are trace elements of phosphorus there, and given the number of cars, what happens is it interacts with fines, little pieces of dirt on the parking lot, and then when it rains, 100% of that stuff heads off to the storm drain and directly out to the river. There may be other sources, atmospheric deposition and the like, and friends of CRWA's and mine actually at Harvard University are going to begin an analysis of exactly what the sources are this January.
Yeah, and
all things being equal and allowing us to all go back to school and stuff like that.
Right. No, and that will be very exciting. And then I know in other presentations you have offered a map of the Great Lakes that shows the agricultural areas and the urban areas, and the phosphorus pollution in the Great Lakes is located next to the urban areas, which again sort of flies in the face of that assumption that I think a lot of us have that, oh, this comes from fertilizer and agriculture. Yeah,
had you asked me, and many people did ask me in like 2001 and 2002 when I made presentations, you know, where does the phosphorus pollution come from? I would say fertilizers on lawns, failed septic systems, and then combined sewers and, you know, other sewage pollution. It's one of the great things about science is to learn how dead wrong you are. Well, it's a very useful tool.
It's consistent with a lot of other messages that we have about how we need to reduce cars and the use of single-use vehicles. And so this is another example of that. All right, let me attack some of the other questions here. Let's see, Owen Kortner asked, is anyone doing design iterations and cost estimates for those restoring / relocalizing water projects?
Yes, actually, CRWA did that under Julie Wood. Who was the director of the project from 2013, I think, to 2016. We did an analysis of restoring the wetland down in Woodette Circle and looked at restoration of streams. We also looked at breaking up wastewater into smaller units and using it to generate electric energy and thermal energy and reusing the reclaimed water, very much mimicking what nature does with wastes in a forest to create lots of energy. And we continue to work on that. As a matter of fact, I continue to work on introducing such treatment plants in the city of Detroit as we speak.
That's great. And so maybe another time we can have that presentation, because that is fascinating. It would have been a lot for tonight, but that would be something I think will be of interest to a lot of folks. So another question, does the EPA regulate phosphorus in rivers in such a way that there can be legal or regulatory challenges to the sources of phosphorus to mitigate the runoff issues?
That is a great question. Phosphorus, EPA can't regulate how much water is in a river. I know this is a little ridiculous, but that's in fact true. So if the Charles River were a fire hose of water, but it was clean, under the Clean Water Act, that would be fine. I mean, not really, but you get the drift. However, they can regulate pollutants and nutrients like nitrates and phosphates are really bad for surface waters. Phosphates are the regulating pollutant in fresh water, and nitrates cause all kinds of cyanobacteria in salt water. So EPA could, in fact, regulate phosphorus to the Charles River. And CRWA in 2015 sued EPA to do exactly that on the basis of the science that they had done with us. We lost that lawsuit on the basis of mandatory duty, that EPA can regulate phosphorus, but it's not required by the law to regulate phosphorus, even if it can be shown that it's causing the river to fail for water quality standards.
Okay. Maybe get to the Q&A. Oh my good team. All right. Has there been an increase in wildlife on the Charles as a result of this cleanup?
Absolutely, a lot more birds. Black-crowned night herons and great blue herons and the like. The Fish and Game, National Fish and Wildlife reintroduced, we worked with them to reintroduce American shad to the river. And I believe that that has taken. The herring run for a while was being used as a run to restock other rivers in New England. I'm not sure that's continuing. I have a picture, which I love, and I'll have to lend to Emily, of a sturgeon swimming in the Charles River. Sturgeon are very susceptible to pollution. And so that sturgeon, his name was Henry, by the way. He was kind of a solitary dude. We've never seen another one, but the fact that there was one at all is remarkable. There are a lot of harbor seals that come into the river chasing fish, which is a good thing. So otters are back. Yes, the answer is wildlife has returned to the river.
And a wonderful way to see them is to actually get out in the river.
Yes, absolutely.
So luckily the weather is starting to allow that. Here's a question from Joel. Any thoughts about the Lake District that borders Waltham, Newton, Weston, and Wellesley? It was once the home of Norumbega Park. Is it cleaner or dirtier than the rest of the Charles?
It's generally speaking cleaner. It has its own problems, the water chestnut problem and the harvesting associated with it, and that's an expression of phosphorus. So although harvesting the water chestnuts now is an interim solution to keep the entire 180 acres of the Lakes District from growing in, the real solution would be to end the phosphorus pollution and over time reduce the amount of phosphorus in the sediments there. And occasionally there are spills there, but by and large, Rita Barron held her first swim in Forest Grove Park in 1979 in Waltham. And I have there are pictures at the office when she hired divers to go out and check to see that nobody was going to be stepping on glass or other bad things. Anyway, there was a diver maybe 100 yards off the riverbank, and all of a sudden he stands up in ankle deep water. He was standing on a VW bug. Somebody threw into the river. I guess you don't throw a VW bug into the river, but they drove it in there.
Wow.
Pushed it in there. So yeah, I mean, it's a really good place to go and visit and canoe and do all those kinds of things.
Let's see, here's a question from Abra. Does the Kendall cogeneration station and the discharge of warmer water into the Charles contribute to blue-green algae development?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because 3 of the big negotiations that occurred when I was executive director with power plants, and their outcomes were all quite good. We started a conversation with Southern Energy in 1998 when they acquired the Kendall Square station. And over the course of 11 years, negotiated with them. The deal is they took over a 65 megawatt fuel oil fired station, and they wanted to turn it into a 254 megawatt natural gas fired station, which actually generates 265 megawatt or 254 megawatts in the area that it's actually used. So there's not a lot of loss of energy via transmission line. That's a good thing. And by switching from fuel oil to natural gas, they actually reduced pollutant emissions in that same area by 4 times over the existing discharge. However, the 77 million gallons of water they took from the Charles to cool their turbines in what's called once-through turbine cooling. So they withdraw the water, they wrap the water in pipes around the turbines, which cools down the turbines, and then they discharge that water with 20 degrees of additional heat back into the river, 77 million gallons a day. I remember thinking to myself, in the summertime, the ambient temperature at the surface of the river is 89 degrees. You add 20 degrees to that, and that's probably not a good thing. Anyway, over the course of negotiations with 5 different owners, we were able to get the plant to switch to combined heat and power. So they changed turbines and they started generating steam with their excess heat. And they used that steam to heat and cool 14 skyscrapers in downtown Boston. They carted across the river. And they reduced their demand on the Charles to 0.
Wow.
So it was a very elegant solution. It took 11 years to get there, and an investment of, I think, about $40 million by the company and by the owners. But it was a much better solution than a paper solution that says, well, we're going to try to do the best we can. And I wish things like that could go a little faster, but you know, an investment for those companies of $40 million was significant. A guy that serves on CRWA's board now was the environmental representative engineer for 4 of those 5 companies. Sean Connery is his name. No, he's not that guy. And he was the engineer who was principal on their side of the fence in getting the companies to make the change. We actually met up accidentally. I was in Atlanta, Hartsfield Airport, and I'm walking through the terminal, and I ran directly into him. And he decided to, you know, give me a lift into the hotel. And over the course of that ride from the airport to the hotel, we decided that this was the right solution for the Charles River. So every once in a while, serendipity helps.
Yeah, and personal relationships.
Definitely helps.
Let's see. Let's see, this is from Jason. How is the redevelopment of the riverfront in Watertown having an impact on the river? Industrial use to large residential buildings?
I don't know. I haven't seen any of the monitoring. There are, I think, 3 monitoring stations there. I'd be concerned from industrial to residential, assuming that it's high density residential, again, about the parking lots and phosphorus. But by and large, it should be better. Mm-hmm. I can tell you this. Remember way back in my conversation on CSOs, where the MWRA was representing that all of this sewage came over the Watertown Dam, and that was sewage coming from the other 280 square miles of the watershed. Well, on our first pass monitoring the river, we discovered that the river met standards right up until it got to Watertown. And then all of a sudden it went off the charts bad.
You listening up from Watertown.
Yeah, so it turned out that there was failed sewage infrastructure where the sewage bounced from the sewage pipe directly into a storm drain and directly out to the river 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and made it look as if the rest of the watershed was contributing all of this sewage that came over Watertown Dam. So our notion of beginning to look at the river as a single unified system and begin to monitor it in that way was significant in our ability to begin to identify the real problems the river faced.
Thank you. Have lead levels been tested at points along the Charles River? Was that part, or has it been part of the water quality testing?
Some lead has been looked at, particularly around Watertown and right below Watertown Dam, since the arsenal there used to manufacture all of the ordnance used in the Civil War by the North was manufactured at Watertown. And you can imagine the amount of lead that was discharged to the river at the time. So there were...
For folks who are new to the area, why is that?
Well, because we use lead in shot and you know, the things that kill people that come out of cannon.
Huge arsenal there, right?
Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, it was bad news.
Called arsenal, but it really was an arsenal.
Yeah, it was the real thing. I remember when they were shutting it down. So this is 94, 95, 96. I went with one of our scientists to look at, they were shutting down their lab. So they had a gas chromatograph and other stuff that, since we were in the process of trying to put together a lab, we decided we'd go over and take a look because they were willing to give it away for free, right? So we go walking into one of these enormous buildings. And everybody that passed us is in the hazmat suit wearing a breather. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I'm wearing a sport coat and a tie.
Right.
Not exactly.
What do they know that I don't know?
Yeah, maybe we should get out of here. Anyway, a lot of that stuff ended up on the bottom of the river. And lead has also been tested throughout the 10 miles of the lower basin in the sediments there, which are also very hammered. If you go swimming in the Charles, one of the things you don't want to do right now anyway is come in contact with the sediments.
Because you've got 400 years of
bad stuff. Well, most of it comes from the dam was built in 1908. And so any of the bad stuff that was dumped.
The Charles River Dam.
The Charles River Dam.
It
so any of the under the Museum of Science.
That completely changed it, no longer tidal. Yes.
Right. And so all of the bad stuff, there were 5 abattoirs, you know, there were several, I think 3 or 4 paint manufacturers who used to discharge. You saw those pictures at the beginning of this. So there's a lot of bad stuff. It all filtered down to the bottom. And unfortunately, it's been sitting there for, what is that, 112 years. And it hasn't really changed in all that time. As a matter of fact, the U.S. Geologic Survey did an analysis. They took 148 samples. We worked with them on this as well to try to figure out what we could do with the sediments. And they came to these conclusions. In the 148 samples, they found 1 worm. His name was Walter, and he was very lonely. The stuff they pulled off the bottom had a consistency of black mayonnaise. There were a lot of polychromatic aromatic hydrocarbons and arsenic and some lead, a lot of phosphorus. You get the drift. PCBs, PBBs in that stuff. It's about 2.5 feet thick, and there are between 4 and 5 million cubic yards of it on the bottom of the river, starting at about Mount Auburn Hospital and going down to the new Charles River Dam. So it's bad, and it still needs to get taken care of.
So you've got some more questions. Anna asks, how effective is green infrastructure adjacent to parking lots for reducing phosphorus?
It can be extremely effective. It's a really good idea. One of the things CRWA did figure out in 04, 05, 06, you remember when I showed you the stream and the street views and what they could look like, is that soils make a big difference. So putting green infrastructure in sort of willy-nilly is useful, but what would be even more useful would be to understand the landscape, understand the soils, what used to be there. Were there creeks there? And if there were creeks in a particular area where you want to build or where you have a parking lot, what's the association of the soils in that area with the old creek bed? And pay attention to restoring the kind of plant life and structure that would have existed had we never built Boston. If we started to do that on a Boston-wide, urban, suburban-wide approach, where with every change we increased the restorative nature of the green infrastructure in that landscape, we would go a long way to dampening the impact of flooding, to restoring groundwater, and to dramatically restoring water quality and flow in the Charles.
And we got to that quite a bit, the presentation last week about the I-90 project. So I hope folks who haven't seen that tune into that. So Owen asks, sediments, did you say yards? Yikes. How would the city take care of that?
Well, the nominal cost is about $600 million to get that stuff out of there. dredge it. And
for where exactly would be 600?
this would be from, you know, Mount Auburn down to the new Charles River Dam.
Yeah.
So you're talking a major dredging project. And it was pretty clear to me that that wasn't happening. So the same Harvard group that's looking at where phosphates come from on parking lots and in cars is going to start taking a look at what's in those sediments. One of the things that occurred to me, and I don't know, maybe this is pie in the sky, you know, Zimmerman being a wingnut, because it's true, I'm often accused of being a wingnut, but nevertheless, what if there was stuff in those sediments that we could reuse? So phosphorus, for example, is becoming an element that's hard to get a hold of. It's more expensive. And there may be other things there too. So they're going to take a look that's in the chemistry department at whether there might be a way to reconstitute some of the stuff in those sediments for sale. Not that you're going to completely eliminate the cost of a $600 million dredging project, but if you could pay for some of it with the sale of some of the stuff that you reconstitute, that would help. It brings down the total cost and helps us head in a direction where it becomes much more affordable for us to confront the issue. I would really like to see sometime relatively soon, next 10, 15 years, before I move on.
Go to that watershed in the sky.
Yeah, big watershed in the sky. See that stuff removed and you know, to see the river fully restored. It's another thing I want to say here is that one of the things that all of the analysis that we did in my 28 years at CRWA, it became very clear to me is that fully restoring the Charles River is possible. We can do that. It's certainly within our reach. And because we can do it, we ought to do it. It will fundamentally change everything about Boston and Cambridge and all the cities, the 23 cities and towns the river runs through.
So someone asked, an anonymous person, what do you know about the Merrimack River in general and through Lowell?
Merrimack's big, 5,000 square mile watershed. One of my good friends used to run the Merrimack River Watershed Council. Lowell has some combined sewer overflow problems. So does Lawrence, and they haven't been addressed. There's something like, I think between the two cities, something like maybe 750 million gallons a year of raw sewage pouring in to the river in those reaches of the river. It's also beginning to have cyanobacteria problems. And the other thing is low in-stream flow, particularly in July, August, September. Demand on the river is such for irrigation and that sort of thing, and climate change issues, that's a concern. The temperature in the river is rising. When the temperature rises, it can't carry as much oxygen, and therefore it can't support habitat, as many fisheries. So there are a lot of things there that need to be looked into. I would recommend that someone do some pretty serious analysis, sort of like CRWA did way back when, as a starting point, to begin to prioritize what needs to be looked at first, second, third, fourth. That's key. I would add that you know, when EPA first started getting everyone together from all of the cities and towns surrounding the river and suggesting that they were going to enforce on illicit cross connections and that something serious needed to be done about CSOs, that all the cities and towns, you know, they weren't very happy about this. Oh, this is going to cost us money and nothing's going to come out of it. I can tell you that by 97, when it became clear that the river was getting better, when the data supported that, all of a sudden the meetings with these folks changed in their nature. We were getting somewhere. They were getting the river back. And that meant something. And they weren't unhappy. And the nature of the relationships between the regulators and the cities and towns and those of us in the environmental community became a lot more collaborative. How do we actually get to, you know, are we really going to be able to swim, and how do you do that? I'm certain on any river in the United States that faces major pollution problems, if you can show that the investment of funds actually restores the environment, that the amount of resistance will drop significantly.
Do you think it's accurate to say that the challenges we face are generally political and not technical?
You know, my knee jerk is to say that's true, except my experience says that's not. Once CRWA became the source of real data and science, and yes, you know, unlike sort of the current situation with this virus we have floating around, everybody shared and believed in the data. So for example, when CRWA built its lab, one of the first things we did was I called up Doug McDonald, I think was the head at the time, and said, Doug, we want to split samples with you.
The head of?
Massachusetts Water Resources Authority. You know, you can get into big battles over data. So I wanted them to believe that our data was the same as their data. So we started splitting samples. So we would run the samples in our lab, they would run the samples in their lab, and we would all come out with the same numbers. And so it built trust. Mm-hmm. You know, that sense of collaboration, we're in this together, we can get somewhere. Those kinds of things reduce the political and get toward, you know, how do you solve the problem? And it did actually help that our solution for the combined sewer overflow problem did save the MWRA $449 million. It kind of got their attention. So they gave us money to do that study. They never gave us money again after that. But the nature of the relationship between CRWA and the MWRA, I hope, remains good. It was very strong through all of my tenure, and I think it probably remains strong. They're interested. They want to see the river recover, and to the extent they can, they want to help.
Heather asks, do you consult with other Massachusetts watersheds for project ideas? She's with the Westfield River Watershed Association. I will say, Heather, we do have a group of EDs that communicates quite a bit, especially through Mass Rivers Alliance and Julia Blatt and Gabby Queenan. But Bob, you may, I don't know if, I don't want to speak for you, what you do.
Well, I'm currently doing some strategic planning with a watershed group in Laredo, Texas, if you can believe it. I would be happy to consult with organizations around here for very little or no money. Depends on how much time, but if I can be helpful and we can change things, I'd be very interested in that.
Wonderful. I like to start and end things on time, and we have about 15 minutes left. Someone had asked what CRWA is working on now. So I thought I would hit a few points, and I do encourage folks to continue to monitor our virtual event series, because that's where we are getting much more in the weeds, so to speak, on some of these issues. So last week we talked about the I-90 project. That's a big priority for us. We are trying to prevent the idea of a temporary 8 to 10 year road in the river as part of the Alston Multimodal project, which is rebuilding the Alston Viaduct. And we think there's an incredible opportunity as part of that project to restore the riverbank in the throat area of the Charles near BU, as well as really do a lot of the things that Bob has been talking about. Right in that area of Alston, there is a buried creek called Salt Creek. There's a whole area that Harvard is going to develop, and if they develop in the right way, there's an incredible opportunity to reduce phosphorus loading into the Charles. So definitely check that presentation out, or check out our website. We definitely would love people's participation and help on that. Another program we have is called the Charles River Climate Compact. My other side gig that I did not describe in the beginning is that I serve as a city councilor in Newton. And so when I started this job, I came into it with the perspective of, wow, local elected officials make a lot of land use and development decisions, and yet virtually none of them have are hydrologists or have this sort of background in understanding. And so, for example, I personally have voted on numerous development projects, road projects, sidewalk projects. Never once was I like, we need to get more green infrastructure in this project. We need to worry about the phosphorus going into the Charles River, because I had not worked in this area before. I had worked at the Sierra Club, working mostly on energy issues, on clean energy issues. So that is something that we are doing, which is a lot of outreach and support for our watershed communities, our municipal staff in the watershed communities, but also local elected officials, where we're literally offering trainings for them. We're also doing more outreach related to activists, climate activists. So that's what the point of the Climate Resilience for Activists event is in a couple weeks. So I encourage folks, actually May 7th, I believe, with CREW, the one that I talked about. And the idea there will be to talk about some of the tools and policies and bylaws that can be passed at the local level that will have an impact on the Charles. We are actively, and there's the other presentation is about dam removal. So we're working actively with Rentham. We're looking at the South Natick Dam. Natick is looking at removing that dam rather than spending a lot of money to fix it. The dams on the Charles, many of them do not really serve any purpose anymore. And that includes the Watertown Dam. So it's a big deal to remove a dam, but it has incredible water quality and ecological benefits. And speaking of the MWRA, we do have a very good relationship with them, and we do want to see the final elimination of CSOs in the lower basin. So that is going to be renewed focus over the next year. So would encourage folks' participation with that. Someone else had asked how they can get involved. Go to our website, shoot us an email. We are doing everything virtually right now for obvious reasons, but when things get back to normal, we have so many ways that people can get involved with us. Getting your hands dirty with invasive polls, or even getting active at the local or state level with advocating for policy changes and law changes that will benefit the Charles. So really would love for anyone who is watching and wants to get more involved, we welcome that. We're even always looking at members. I mean, there's really, we really have a low barrier to entry to get involved with CRWA. So we'd love to have folks, do that. So let's see, we've got a few more minutes. Let's see. Andrew asks, following on the idea that we should keep water local as it is in nature, rather than seeing it as something to control and channel, are there natural ways, or at least productive ways, to capture phosphorus runoff from transportation beyond an enormous effort to redesign urban landscapes with a bunch of rain gardens, etc.? That is there a much bigger way to process and remediate phosphorus runoff in between the stormwater drains and the river, like localized remediation as part of the drainage?
There are a number of companies that have come up with phosphate removing inserts for storm drains. They work sometimes very well, sometimes not quite so well. The big thing is maintenance. City maintenance for storm drains is not so great. Really great facilities management for storm drain grates is once a year. They stop by and vacuum out sand and dirt and stuff. That's not enough for maintenance for phosphate removal. So there may in fact be technical ways of installing. The same thing is true of nitrates. Nitrates are actually more difficult to remove than phosphates. I would say that the benefits, the net benefits of introducing green infrastructure into the city, particularly given what we're facing with climate change, argue in favor of moving in that direction. So for example, the increase in 1% storms, that is 100-year storms, in the Northeast is off the charts, 71% since 1958. And the likelihood that we're going to get hit with flood-causing precipitation in the coming 10 years is extremely high. I would say, I don't know, I haven't done the science and I haven't read anybody that's done the modeling and prediction, but it's got to be in the 70, 80, 90 percentile range that we're going to get hit with rainstorms of 12 inches in 3 hours, or 20 inches in 24 hours, or 36 inches in 2 days. And when that happens, the amount of flooding associated is off the charts. If all we do is introduce technical fixes that remove phosphorus from runoff, the flooding in the city of Boston and Cambridge is going to be off the charts. It's going to cause severe damage, and the economic displacement is going to be enormous. If, on the other hand, we take that time to begin to reintroduce green infrastructure, which holds and infiltrates water, and select creeks we made go away, the likelihood of our being able to handle 12 inches, 15 inches of rain in a particular storm is actually pretty high. And the costs associated would argue that that's the sort of thing that we ought to start doing right now, which is one of the things that CRWA is very interested in. I don't want to speak for Emily and the staff there. With the whole I-90 project, that area is under threat of flooding, and with the reintroduction of Salt Creek and associated green infrastructure, that little creek could end up protecting a square mile or two Boston University and Harvard University's new campus and part of the city itself and the city of Alston. So it makes sense for us to begin to think that way and start to build those sorts of restorations.
Someone, Timothy shared the link to Climate Boston. Some are focusing on this, Climate Boston. But he said, Bob, glad to hear you are looking at the future weather issues, climate change and flooding. Some are focusing on this. He encouraged us to get in touch with some climate activist folks. That actually is the point of the presentation next week. I came from, as I mentioned earlier, I was working at Sierra Club. Before this is the Massachusetts director, which was much more in the area of energy. And one thing that's been really exciting about coming over to the water side of things is that, well, everything has its jargon and its technicalities. But, you know, retail net metering, building codes, municipal aggregation, like clean energy can be pretty, you know, engineering and technical. Whereas on this side, when you're saying, you know, what we need is to bring nature back into our built environment, like everyone loves that. And especially now with everything going on, what is the one thing that we can all do and that we all want to do and we are doing to the extent we can is getting out in nature and walking, whether by ourselves or with our families. And at base, that's what this is. It's bringing nature back into our built environment. in a way that will restore the natural hydrology, improve water quality, but it also has all of these demonstrated mental health benefits for all of us. So it's a really exciting time, I think, to be doing this work because more and more people are recognizing the value of it. Andrew said, thank you so much. This was terrific. Thank you, Andrew, for saying that. Let's see, David, let's see, we've got 4 more minutes. So David, you'll be our last question. How does street cleaning affect storm drains and the phosphorus count?
If you get a vacuum cleaner street sweeper, so the guys that go drive along and with one of those trucks that make all that noise, they do actually a pretty good job, and they can measurably decrease the phosphates getting into the river. So some of the low-hanging fruit in reducing phosphorus pollution to the river would be to, require, encourage, require is better, owners of parking lots, big parking lots, to vacuum those parking lots a couple times a year, and the same with street sweeping. That sort of cleaning helps a lot. And then the question is, what do you do with that stuff? But that's a separate question. So at least we're getting to a place where we're beginning to reduce the amount of phosphates getting into the river and causing problems.
Yes. Another thing we could all be doing is walking and biking more, less driving. Or if you have to drive, have an electric
drive an electric car like Emily does.
Emily does, yeah.
Yes, that helps too.
Someone asked, can you access recordings of previous presentations? Yes, recordings and slides are on our website. Just reach out if you can't find them, but hopefully you will be able to find them. And with that, Bob, we're going to call it a night. Thank you so much. This was fabulous, as I knew it would be. And I'm sure we will be talking soon because we talk or text almost every day. Thanks, Bob, and thanks everyone.
Take care. Bye.